Hey everybody, I'm Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome to the latest edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. So much going on this week. We are going to talk about the California corner, if you will, on this ongoing House Speaker vote. It's been a wild ride.
It sure has. And what continues to also be a wild and contentious ride is the conflict in the Middle East and the reverberations that it continues to have here in Southern California as well.
And believe it or not, there's still a whole lot of local politics going on in the mix. We'll tell you about a district attorney candidate forum that happened in LA County this week. So let's start off, Sara, I almost feel like we should take a page from the NPR Politics podcast and timestamp this puppy. We are recording on Thursday late morning. Jim Jordan has said he's not going to seek a third vote for now. There is a plan going on to have Representative McHenry from North Carolina be this kind of interim House Speaker with maybe some expanded capabilities. By the time this goes to air, maybe that will already be said and done. That we don't know. But what we do know is that Jim Jordan went into it thinking it was all his, right, and that didn't happen.
Appears to be out, right? I mean, so there was a couple votes that have occurred, and both times he has come up short. Interestingly, in those votes, Hakeem Jeffries comes up with more votes than any of the Republicans. All the Republicans are all split. But that's not how it works. No, of course not.
Unfortunately,
of course
maybe
not.
For him.
Absolutely. And I think that there's so many telling signs. I think so many things that we can look at that what might be implied in some of the votes of these individuals who voted against Jim Jordan. Right. And I think in some regards, folks were surprised to see how much support he received. Yeah. He's, of course, much further aligned with Trump and the MAGA Republicanism that we have seen in these latest years, seen as kind of a bulldog for the Trump agenda. And I think some were actually surprised to see 200 members actually line up in support of Jim Jordan during this time period. And yet at the same time, there's also a sense of maybe folks just want there to be a speaker and to move on. Yeah.
I think there is the why were people casting those votes, which I think kind of gets us to, some of our local Congress members. And there was this really kind of extraordinary pressure campaign led by the likes of Sean Hannity, a Fox News host. I got to say, I'm an old school journalist. You might have opinions. You really try to do your best to keep them to yourself. And you certainly don't use your position of power to try to pressure people. And I think, it's kind of a fine line. There was this email that went out that one of his producers, this woman named Stephanie, sent. And it was basically, there is a hey, how are you going to vote on this? We need to know by this time. But there's the how could you possibly not vote for Jim Jordan? And that is not that's not an informational question. Right. And that was certainly very powerful. And I think it had some Congress members thinking you better vote for this guy. Yeah. But I think what's also really interesting, for me, the big story, and for example, a lot of the California Republican delegation lined up behind Jim Jordan on the first vote. Ken Calvert out in the Inland Empire voted for Kevin McCarthy. Then almost immediately after was but, he did that because he was really upset about what happened to Kevin McCarthy and the pressure there. But then he kind of changed his mind and said, in the second vote, I'm going to vote for Jim Jordan. I spoke to the guy. And that's exactly what happened. But this pressure campaign also came from these very pro-Trump voices. There's a woman named Amy Kramer, who's part of several groups. She, did a Stop the Steal rally on January 6th. And she has been blasting on social media saying, here's the photographs of the people who are not voting for Jim Jordan. Here are their direct lines. And people were calling, and not just people from their district or their state, but from all over the country. I'm guessing probably some Californians, too, dialing up some of those other states to say, you better vote for Jim Jordan. But of course, in this very heated world, I think some of it really crossed the line. And you had people like Don Bacon, who said, I'm never going to vote for Jim Jordan, his wife, getting these really belligerent texts, your husband better do this. There are several now members of Congress reporting death threats. Not a good look.
Not a good look. Not a good look. And you see this kind of pressure, and it's almost shocking in some ways. I mean, there was a time, not that long ago, that if your party held the majority in Congress, then it was incumbent upon the leadership of your party to be able to garner the support. And I think we just continue to see this fracturing within the Republican Party. There are fractures within the Democratic Party, but not in this level, certainly not in Congress, not in this way. I mean, the inability to have a Speaker of the House for their party just really shows this deep fracturing that it exists within the party. And I am so curious about how that's going to play out in this upcoming 2024 election. And you mentioned the SoCal connection, SoCal Republicans, lining up in support of Jim Jordan with some caveats, perhaps. Yeah. I'm curious how that plays out come election time. Does that get used against them by their opponents, given the kind of politics that Jim Jordan really represents? These are, especially here in Southern California, some very competitive seats. Mike Garcia, of course, in the Antelope Valley,
and the congressman from Texas actually called for Mike Garcia to be Speaker of the House twice. It was the weirdest thing.
Fascinating stuff, and that would be interesting to see another. And
yet Mike Garcia voted for Jim Jordan.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
I'm going to throw out here, I know, Sarah, I'm going to do this a little bit on the fly, because we've been banding about what could our What's the Word segment be, and I'm just going to make an executive call here. What's the word? Voice. And I think what this week has really illustrated is whose voice are you listening to, right? Are you listening to all of those angry people who are texting and calling? And yeah, they're definitely some of your constituents, but it may be that not the people who are like, look, government, just do your business. Enough of this, are not taking the time to call. I don't think this is going to have a huge impact come 2024, because we're just seeing how much is going on, how swiftly things change. I actually spoke this week with Sean Steele, husband of Congressmember Michelle Steele, and this was before she had said how she was going to vote, and this was before the first vote happened. And I said, do you think this is going to have an impact? And he was like, you know what? I think people are more concerned about coffee. And he's like, look, I'm in my local Starbucks. He's like, people aren't even really talking about Israel, let alone this House Speaker vote. Like, all the political nerds, like, I was like, we are so focused on it. But he was like, most people don't care that much, and especially by the time we get to the March primary, like, you got to think this is going to be
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right on some levels. However, I think it's incumbent upon the opponents of these folks, if they wanted to use it and to push. I mean, we saw that with abortion in 2022, right? Like, this was an issue that was not even decided in Congress, and yet pushing this narrative about where does the current member stand if you're trying to attack, right? So this is fodder for an opponent to use as an attack against them. And I agree. I mean, as with most issues, right? Many of the scandals in Los Angeles included, what we tend to find is a majority of people don't even know about that it's happening. Right?
Well, and I think if Jim Jordan eventually does become Speaker, because that could happen, and he starts making, he said he was going to work with everybody. He said he wasn't going to let the government shut down. But then, like, you heard Tom Cole in his nominating speech talk about, like, getting rid of Social Security benefits if he gets that job. And if he really pushes hard to his, like, original agenda, then I think you're right. We could see some of that, like Roe versus Wade being overturned kind of backlash. I do wonder, too, when it comes to the local connection, I don't think too much to be made out of this, but the fact that our past two House speakers were from California, that, like, we're many different things. We are the home of big tech. We are the home of Hollywood. Like, talk about places where you need to know how to negotiate. And not that Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy were really hip deep in either of those worlds, but I do think that part of being a, like, successful Californian is about being able to broker some seriously difficult deals. And, like, right now, there is no name that's like, I feel like if there was some magic Republican name that would be perfect for this job, we would have heard about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I think that's been the issue, is there is no magical name. I mean, we keep, we went through McCarthy, Scalise, now Jordan, now, and that didn't work, right? So I think that's the real challenge is again, going back to that fracturing within the party. There's no magical person who's been able to negotiate even amongst their own party, and this seems to be the real the real shtick of it.
Except for the one little, in case you missed it, it's not going to happen. But just before the first vote, Congressman Brad Sherman of the San Fernando Valley floated. Did you hear this? Who he floated, Sarah?
No.
Probably not, right? Because you're getting coffee and doing the things the rest of us do. He suggested George W. Bush. Which I was, all right, sure, like, why not? I don't think that's going to happen, but it will be interesting to see, all these folks who've been galvanizing for Jim Jordan. It doesn't look like
I'm kind of stunned here. Like, George, the former
really
president,
literally
George
said that. Yeah,
okay.
I didn't really agree with him on a lot of things, but he's, a reasonable guy who could, he'd write, and the House Speaker doesn't have to be a current member of the House.
Sure,
so
fair.
Sure, why not?
Okay.
Let's put a pin on that, because who knows?
I'm not seeing that as a possibility, but hey, you never know.
But you never, ever
has the negotiating skills.
It's kind of like the LaFonza Butler, right? Before she was named, it was like Oprah Winfrey, Jerry Brown, Barbara Boxer, like who knows?
And maybe there is someone lying in wait who can really, step in and fill this role.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he's got a new book out,
and he's all over social media,
right? The
beloved, right?
part of it.
Talk about a comeback career,
right? Yeah. All right. So I'm glad we could get some laughs out, because now we're going to move to the very serious topic that is just dominating so much of politics throughout the world, the situation in the Middle East. And here in Los Angeles County, the Board of Supervisors this week, they took up this motion. They unanimously approved it. It's a resolution condemning what they called the surprise attack by Hamas against Israel and pledging support to Israel. But again, those voices, right, when they considered it, it got very contentious. At one point, they had to shut down the meeting. There were a lot of people who called in. There were a lot of people who showed up in person, and they were vehemently opposed to this. And I think what's really interesting, Sarah, is that a lot of them were Jewish people who talked at great length about their connections to Israel. I want to take a look. This is one of the folks who spoke in opposition to this resolution. Her name is Emma Bornstein.
It's so painful to watch. As an American Jew, my grandparents escaped from Germany and Austria and went to Palestine and came to the U.S., and I do not think that it is okay in our name, the descendants of Holocaust survivors, to conduct another genocide on a people. This trauma and this pain needs to end, and we need to, as a city, stand up and say that we cannot continue this, and making a statement only for Israel is a continuation of that harm, and we need to right now essentially include everyone. We are a multi-faith, a multiracial community. Los Angeles so diverse, and we cannot ignore Palestinian lives right now, or we will be complicit in that.
And Sarah, this is, I think, a trend that we're seeing, especially among some younger Jews who didn't necessarily grow up in the 1970s, who might have a different view of what can and should be done here. At a certain point, I was listening through to the testimony, and I could hear a little bit of a script that I think probably there's a group called If Not Now that has been organizing some demonstrations, and it seems like they had these talking points of, yes, I am a Jew, yes, I'm really concerned about what's happening there, but I don't think this is the way to do it, even though there are also speakers who very vocally said, stand with Israel 100%. Right. And what I wonder is, if you're an elected official, this is one of many reasons I will never be in politics, is how do you discern, okay, I've got all these people who took time out of their day to come into this meeting and say, I oppose this, but how do you compare that to potentially thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of silent individuals who might have very strong feelings in opposition?
Yeah, and my goodness, I mean, this goes back to even to the 1970s, thinking about the silent majority, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is true on so many cases. I mean, we've seen on other issues, right? Whether it's defunding the police or homelessness, crime issues, loud voices in City Hall as well, and at the Board of Supervisors at different points in time, certainly at the police commission meetings as well. And yet at the same time, we see many of our elected officials saying, no, this is even Mayor Karen Bass saying, no, this, I hear you, I hear your perspective, but yours is not the only one representing Angelenos. And while you are here and you are very loud, Mayor Bass, for example, in the case of police and funding the police, has said absolutely, no, we're not going to defund the police. No. We are going to absolutely double down and try to hire more, in fact, because I'm elected by all of the people. And I think this is obviously a very different situation, but the elected officials, I think, tend to be in a similar place on this. When you look at polling, so the Pat Brown Institute in the past has done polls of Jewish Angelenos, the last one being done in 2019. The Pew Research Center doing opinion polling on Jewish people throughout the United States. Across the board, the majority of Jewish people, not all, as with any community, any ethnic community, they are not monoliths. There is diversity of opinion, but the majority support the state of Israel, despite the fact that they may not support the leadership of Israel and certainly may not support Netanyahu in particular. That has been true for quite some time, in fact. And no doubt that is probably weighing on the minds of these elected officials as they're moving this forward. Yeah, there's a loud group that are showing up. There's probably a whole lot of other people who can't take time out of their day who think differently, though, about these issues. Yeah. And I think there is this change, right? I mean, as you mentioned, many of the folks who showed up were younger, perhaps more progressive. And certainly we are seeing some shifts in that region. I'm hoping some of these institutions are going to continue to do polling on this issue, especially because it's so hot right now.
Oh, absolutely.
So that we can continue to kind of measure and see exactly where folks' feelings are lying on these issues.
One person who's not waiting for the polls to come out, Governor Gavin Newsom just announced he's had this long planned out trip to China. He's going there next week, but he just announced that he will be going to Israel en route to kind of check in there. I think one more indication, much like what we saw, God, Sarah, so much is going on. Well, just side note here that last weekend was the deadline for him to sign off on or veto all the bills that had been approved in the state legislature. And a lot of folks had noted that, whereas in the past, Gavin Newsom has been this, like, I'm super progressive, I'm super on the left. And now he's kind of pulling a little bit more of a Jerry Brown and doing what they call the canoe approach. You paddle a little to the left, you paddle a little to the right. And we saw that. And I think this trip, depending on how he plays it to Israel, could be one more example. They were saying the reason why he kind of took a lot of the stances that he took, saying no to things that he might have said yes to in the past, is probably an indication that he is gearing up for the next chapter of his career, whatever that might be, where you're maybe appealing to a much more mainstream audience than you are here in California.
Yeah. One other thought to that, though, just in terms of a trip to Israel, I think it's interesting. In going back to the Board of Supervisors meeting, I heard many of the members of the Board of Supervisors, and remember, there's only 5, but many of them talking about multiple trips that they have made to Israel and the way that influenced their thinking on these issues. And I think that the trips to Israel is an interesting piece, and certainly that's playing out nationally as well for folks who have made trips to Palestine and hearing those voices as well, and just hearing the real difference of opinions.
And on that note of that personal connection, we should also note that one of the different situations here is that for the first time ever, you have a first gentleman. He is Jewish, Southern California's own Doug Emhoff, who, was talking to the LA Times about really what a difficult moment this has been for him. He has been working pretty much ever since entering that position of first gentleman, or second gentleman, sorry, the gender, the numbers, it's a lot, that he's been working so hard. He actually took a trip out here to Southern California, I want to say not within the past 6 months, to meet not only with all of these local Jewish leaders, but also members of Hollywood. And there's been this real push now. One of the ways that Jewish leaders in this country have been looking to kind of shift the narrative, curb anti-Semitism is through Hollywood. They see storytelling as a really pivotal role. And then it's been complicated because there's been a writer's strike and there's been an actor's strike. But it's very interesting to kind of note Doug Emhoff's role in this. There was he talked about conversations that he had with Joe Biden. And I think Joe Biden, he gave a speech earlier this week in Israel talking about his solidarity, again, with the Israeli people, but also talked about being careful to not let rage get the best of you, as it did for many people after 9/11, and the dangers of that, and that kind of, taking a breath moment that you and I have been talking about. This week, Kamala Harris, Vice President Doug Emhoff's wife, there was a protest. A bunch of folks who came out, roughly about 100 from the group, If Not Now, calling for a ceasefire in the Middle East in front of her house. I mean, I do wonder, too, especially with an eye towards 2024, some are speculating that if this continues on, which seems much like the battle for House Speaker, it seems like it will. The voices grow stronger, and you could wind up in a situation where someone like Cornel West could be a little bit of a Ralph Nader-esque or Jill Stein-esque spoiler, where his very different stance on what's happening there could pull away some of that support from Joe Biden for someone who believes in some of these ideals, but not in aligning so strongly with Israel.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I not only are tempers rising here in Los Angeles, but in the United States, but the fear is very real. Yeah. I mean, just even having reached out to Muslim friends, colleagues this week, folks canceling travel, fearing for students on their campuses among some of my colleagues as well, and just trying to create some safe space for folks to be who they are, right? Yeah. Outside of some of this conflict even. Of course, we saw the murder of a young child just outside of Chicago as well. So certainly this is having all sorts of reverberations and effects here in the United States and here in Los Angeles that we have to take seriously as well.
And I think one of the tricky parts about that, Sarah, if I can use this as an opportunity to move into our third topic, is there's so much that's going on in the world that you almost forget, and, in D.C., that you almost forget for a moment how much is happening right here in Southern California. This week, there was a candidate forum that was sponsored by a number of law enforcement groups, including the Sheriff's Union, the Police Protective League. It was held. This was a fascinating venue. I'd never been here before.
And you were there, right?
I was there
okay.
The Pacific Palms Resort,
the
city of
Sounds
Industry.
so fancy.
It was this beautiful, sprawling country club. I was like, where am I? I'd never been in there before. It was really beautiful. And this huge hall, like really, really big, almost the same size of, or close to what we saw President Trump a couple of weeks ago. Not nearly as many people in it, because I think right now with everything going on, who's paying attention to the DA's race? But you should be, because it's a really critical
it's a hot
role.
one.
And just to recap here, again, where I think, too, we forget some of the history. So back in 2020, Jackie Lacey was the DA, and there were two candidates vying to replace her, George Gascón, Rachel Rossi. And fast forward to this year, 9 candidates vying to replace George Gascón is a lot. They were all on the stage last night. That was a lot. They organized, it was fascinating. They had all these podiums. They organized them by last name alphabetical. So the first one being Deborah Archuleta, who's a judge, going all the way to Eric Siddle, who's a deputy district attorney. And then at the very end, not in alphabetical order, and I got to think there was some staging to all of this, was an empty podium for George Gascón. And I was joking.
Wow, they actually kept the empty podium.
Empty podium.
Right?
Well, and let's not say kept, right? Because they knew for weeks that he wasn't coming. They've been sending out emails saying George Gascón is not coming, yet they made the podium and they made the sign and all the rest of it.
Go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say, I mean, like when Trump doesn't show up to the GOP debates, there was no empty podium for him, right?
Good point.
That's interesting.
That's a really good point. And
that's an optics, right? There's an optics thing.
Well, and there is that thing, like, why did Trump not show up to the debate? There was no reason for him to do so. Like, nothing about that was going to, because everybody was going to be, like, shooting straight for him. Yeah. And I actually talked about this earlier this week with Lori Levinson at Loyola, and I was like, is there a parallel here? She's like, yeah, except for George Gascón does not have nearly the numbers that Donald Trump has, not nearly the same kind of support. And, of course, having that empty podium there gave all these candidates, like, a real opportunity to hammer in on, like, and the dude's not even here. Let's take a listen to Eric Siddle. The question here was about crime and safety. And literally, James Quilly of the LA Times and I were joking about it. Remember when Clint Eastwood gave that speech at the RNC to the empty chair? Yeah. Okay, kind of had those vibes about it. Here's what Eric Siddle had to say.
So this guy here thinks that thefts are victimless crimes, and we know that's not true. Thefts destroy incomes, they destroy families, they destroy neighborhoods. But this guy thinks it's a victimless crime. We need to stop that mentality. We need to start putting people in custody the moment they're arrested. He had a chance, he failed.
This guy, wow, that's some hot energy.
Now, I reached out to George Gascón's office, and here's what they told me. They said that he had a previous commitment to meet with a Democratic club. He did just announce over this past weekend that he's running for re-election. He's got a whole lot of endorsements from Labor, from Congressman Tony Cardenas, Assemblymember Tina McKinnon, City Council member Eunices Hernandez. They were all there. But here's a note, because I remember actually in one of the early debates in 2020, I moderated a debate. All three candidates were invited. Rachel Rossi and George Gascón showed up. Jackie Lacey did not. And George Gascón said some things about that at the time in one of his public statements. This was a very different debate that Jackie Lacey didn't show up at. But they put this, I went back, it's still on the Gascón for DA website. His quote was, "This is a public official that has gone to extraordinary lengths to dodge the public. It's time for Jackie Lacey to come out of her bunker and face the music."
Always tough when the tables now turn.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is, who knows, like how many DA debates will be. I will also just like raise a math question, because politics and math, we saw it with the House Speaker vote, and I think we might see it again here with this race. I thought, a number of these candidates were very impressive. I don't know how much difference we really saw in this first like big official, televised debate. We really saw that much difference between them. Because there are 9 of them, I can't help but wonder, for anybody who doesn't like George Gascón, and there are a lot of those folks, does there having been 9 of them dilute the vote so much that it kind of winds up backfiring and a certain amount of the vote to George Gascón, especially considering, remember, in the primary, if he gets more than 50%, then that's it. I don't think it'll come to that. I think probably 1 or 2 of these candidates will really rise to the top, but I don't know.
I think that's probably right. And that's not to suggest that George Gascón couldn't win the election at the end of the day. But, I'm thinking also about the re-election or the attempted re-election of Sheriff Villanueva in 2022. That was also a very large field of candidates at the primary stage. But what we saw after the primary was all of those candidates rallied behind Robert Luna and said, we actually all very much agree that Villanueva needs to go, and so we all are going to support Robert Luna. I don't know if that's going to be the case.
Oh no,
I do
actually, because that was one of the questions last night. Yeah,
please tell me.
In addition to the like longer talking answers, there was a brief section where they all had little paddles, green for thumbs up, red for thumbs down with a little thumb on it, and the question was, if your campaign is not successful, would you rally behind anyone else here on this stage? And unlike, the awkward moment on the Republican presidential, would you support Trump? Everybody's just green thumb went right up. I think there was any question about that. So I think the answer is yes, they'll all rally behind someone. Who that someone will be remains.
It
or
won't
maybe
be George Gascón.
Right. Or maybe there's so much, and there's supposed to be a poll. It's not out yet. It's supposed to be out today on the day that we're recording. If and when I get it, I will share it on the social media channels. But yeah, I think this is one of many races that is going to be very interesting.
Indeed.
And last but not least, something I did not have on my political bingo card.
Me neither.
I sent you the email in the dark 100 hours of the morning this week. Former TV journalist Christina Pascucci has announced, as a Democrat, she is running in the race to replace Dianne Feinstein. Sarah, what do you make of this?
This is already a very crowded field.
Yes.
That makes it hard for any candidate. Certainly, she has name recognition. She comes across as saying, I want something different. I am a Democrat, but I'm independent-minded. That's all great. I think, as I have said many times, with the statewide race, like the Senate race, one that is hotly contested already, any candidate is going to need a whole lot of campaign funds in order to be effective at getting out their message. And I think that'll be a question that I have: is what is your campaign finance strategy strategy really looking like at this point? Are you really able to go hit media markets by the time the primary comes around?
Yeah. When you're up against Katie Porter
and Adam Schiff that have banked millions at this point. Right.
Yeah. And she's pregnant, which is part, if you look at the campaign video, right, that's part of the reason why she's doing it.
She said that was her inspiration for running.
Yes.
And I thought, gosh, when I was pregnant, my inspiration was to like lie on the couch, but go you.
And drink chocolate milk in my case. Yes, absolutely. My favorite tweet of the week goes to my colleague, Kate Cagle here at Spectrum, who's like, I'm also pregnant and I'm due next year. And like, I'm sitting out. I'm not covering this season. I'm not running this season. Kate, hats off to you, my friend. One last note before we go, a quick correction to something I said on last week's podcast, that City Council member Nithya Raman did not issue her statement on DSA's platform on the situation in the Middle East until Wednesday. It was my bad. That came out on Tuesday. That is it for this week's edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. If you want to tell us you're running for Senate or anything else, find us out there. I am at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.